Today's topic is the geopolitics of the human rights situation in Baluchistan. And first of all, I would like to thank the co-organizers, which is the World Baluch Organization and the Congress of Nationalities for Federal Iran, for their support in convening this event. And then I would also say thank you to our speakers, Mr. Nasser Boladai, Mr. Christine Fair, Senator Paul Strauss, who made it here very last minute, and then Tikumar with Amnesty International is going to join us a little bit later. To give you some background information for those of you who are not familiar with UNPO, we are an international, democratic, and non-violent organization founded in The Hague in 1991. And we have offices, our main secretariat is in Brussels, and as of very recently, also we're present here in DC. And we work to give a platform to over 40 different minorities, indigenous groups, and unrecognized or occupied territories across the world. And for today's topic, I think what makes today's event so important is that both in Pakistan and Iran, minorities are under siege and most affected by both states' excessive use of violence are religious and ethnic minorities, and above all, the people of Baluchistan. And gross human rights violations such as torture and forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings are still the order of the day on both sides of the border. And while local human rights defenders struggle to address these systematic abuses, both Tehran and Islamabad use intimidation tactics to silence anyone who dares bringing these crimes to light. Both governments deliberately use radical Islam to undermine and discredit these strands of the movement, of the Baluch movement, who are peaceful. And meanwhile, partners in the West often just pay lip service to changing the status quo for other interests, such as business. So our role as UNPO today and also in our daily work is to offer a platform for these issues to be discussed and for human rights activists to give testimonies of what is happening in these countries. So in the name of UNPO, let me thank you all again for your presence today, for what will without doubt be an important discussion. To give you just a quick rundown of today's events, we will start with opening remarks by Nasser and Senator Strauss. We will also have a short video statement by Bawal Mengal, who is a London-based activist, and he is a representative of the World Baluch Organization. We will then hear contributions by Christine Fair and then Tikumar after that. And after that, we will have some time for a Q&A session. So I would ask you to keep your questions for after the contribution so that we could have the discussion then. And if you happen to follow us live on the Facebook live stream, please feel free also to ask questions, so maybe we can include those as well. And I would now give over to Nasser Boladai, just a short bio. He was born and raised in Western Baluchistan, but left the country and is now based in Sweden. And he contributed to numerous articles on self-determination, federalism, and Baluchi language and literature. And he is the spokesperson for the Baluchistan People's Party, and also happens to be the president of UNPO. So Nasser, I would give over to you.
Thank you very much, dear Marvin. And first of all, I would like to thank you for organizing this event here today, and of course, thank you also the panelists that have come. And I'm very grateful to be here, and I think we can show some of those pictures to just give a background about Baluchistan. This is just to show that, well, Baluchistan, it was a country in the 18th century at least, and you can see it encompasses a large part of today's Baluchistan. But then, of course, that was later was. We can go to the next picture. I think we have to go quickly, and then we can see it as also the process of this British, after the British came, and 1928 and 1992, part of Baluchistan was given to Iran, and later also part of Baluchistan was given to Pakistan, and today, as you can see, it is divided between those three countries. And geopolitically also, as you can see, the next picture, Baluchistan has this pipelines all over. It's just trying to go from the Gulf, from the Central Asia to the Gulf region, and from that region to the India and to the China. Of course, this is because of geopolitics, and this is also making some impact in Baluchistan. That's why I'm showing those pictures. And here you can see the Baluchistan, where it's situated in Iranian side of Baluchistan totally, and then go to the next because I was shown. And then we can see it here, that also those pictures that we have from plans from the China and also from India to use Chabahar as a route to reach also both to China and through to Afghanistan for the Indian interest currently. And this is all making life very difficult for the Baluch people. The occupation of those two countries, particularly, I will concentrate now in Iran. As we can see, I showed Baluchistan there as one proper geographical region, but in Iran also is divided in many other provinces. It has been also documented from the human rights organization, Human Rights Watch and others, that Iran, since the beginning, tried to make sure that Baluchistan is divided within Iran so that there is no majority Baluch area, and also they made sure that the communication between Baluch areas are very much limited. The thing is that this geopolitical interests that have increased in Baluchistan, this has made increased attention from the Iranian government also. Just this week, the Iranian parliament and the interior minister were discussing to divide Baluchistan again in 3 provinces. And the reason is that they want to change the demography of Baluchistan. It is also in this year, in the March, the Rouhani government announced that they are planning to resettle about 2 more million people to the coastal region of Baluchistan. And they are claiming, at least the claim could be right, that Baluchistan could accommodate very fast 2 more million people in its land. But the reason that the government is doing that one is to change the demography of the region. This is because we know currently in Baluchistan, 70% of Baluchistan people live below the poverty line. Actually, just today I looked and then Google. There are 2 provinces. One province that has the highest number of the unemployed is Kermanshah, which is Kurdish dominated, and second was Baluchistan. In all the cities and everywhere in Iran. And giving that reason, why would think then why do not give job and opportunity first to people that are living there, and instead bring some other people? Of course, Iranian plan is not bringing ordinary people to Baluchistan also. It's mostly military men from the Iranian army, from the Revolutionary Guard. It is to safeguard, as they say, the Macron coast from the influence, or they're sharing the influence of the US or the Western, and that's why also they are working, cooperating both with India, China, and Russia. While the Iran says that Baluchistan can accommodate 2 more million people, we can see that unemployment is very high, it's 2-digit in Baluchistan, and for many youth in Baluchistan there is no way to live there. Many of them move to abroad, to the neighboring country to find job, or other places in Iran. And some also go to, for instance, there are other kind of job in the black market, but some of them started selling gasoline in Iran, since Iran also made the gasoline kind of limited for every person. So they try to sell gasoline in the black market, and those people always are targeted by Iranian authority just to shoot and kill. They never arrest them. Sometimes they fire on them so much that if the fire happen to hit the gasoline, many of them are banned. Just last week, one of those young men trying to transport gasoline to somewhere to sell it, he was just chased by the Iranian security forces, and he tried to find refuge in a home. And the Iranian security forces went ahead with the killing, with the firing. And at that incident also, I can show you the picture of this 2-year-old Baluch boy also was killed in that incident. And this is the latest phase of the Iranian extrajudicial killings in Baluchistan. And all this while that Iran wants to bring more people in Baluchistan, while we see the Baluch people are in what kind of situation. And another aspect, and the third aspect of the Iranian used of misuse of their influence and the control over Baluchistan is using Islam as a kind of political tools in Baluchistan for the propagating the sectarian version of Islam, the political Islam that they want to use it to get hegemony in Iran and also in the region. And in that, they cooperate also with neighboring countries like Pakistan. In our understanding, we have many ground realities that we see that Iran and Pakistan are involved in supporting the extremist group like Lashkar-e-Khorasan and other extremist group. It is to create the false impression that political dynamics should be in the form of extremist Islam in that region, because there should be all kind of the discussion and debate should be either Shia Islam is good or Sunni Islam is good. There should not be any other kind of development for the region. And it's also to change the situation and lifestyle of the Baluch to more Islamic, and they would claim that this Baluchistan is Islamic land. We Baluch have been resisting both version of these extremist groups, be it Sunni, be it Shia, Pakistani version of the Sunni and Iranian version of the Shiism, which is being used as a political tool against Baluch people and for discrimination and about gaining control of the Baluch land. But the thing is that if this continues, of course, we cannot challenge the might of Iran and Pakistan and some other regional interests which are trying to use political Islam. So that's why we think it is for the international community. If Baluchistan is left alone, to let Iran and Pakistan decide over Baluchistan, we think they are trying to create another circumstances for another extremist group like Taliban, Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. And that's why we think it is high time that the international community also pays attention to the atrocities by both Iran and Pakistan in that region, suppressing Baluch national democratic struggle for the self-determination, and instead trying to create circumstances for more kind of Islamic thought and Islamic schools and using Islam as a political tool instead of what is Islam should be a religion for worship for the people, for their own personal religion. So that's why we think it's very important that the international community pays attention to the Baluchistan situation. I thank you again, everybody. Thank you much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nasser. I think, yeah. I think it's always good to be reminded that there are like human faces behind all these reports and records we have of these violations, but I think especially the international community tends to forget that it's real cases affecting people there. I would now give over to Senator Paul Strauss, who is the elected United States Senator for the District of Columbia, and he is currently serving his third term in this position. He is a member of the Democratic Party and, needless to say, an active supporter of DC statehood, and he has worked on this issue with former President Obama and other voting senators and US representatives. And the District of Columbia is also a UNPO member. They became a member in 2015. And I would just give over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Marvin. I appreciate the opportunity to bring greetings on behalf of the District of Columbia. The people of Washington, D.C. are proud to host this conference, as we are so many interesting discussions about the fate of the world and its people today. Our involvement is a little bit different, but the Baluch and the District of Columbia share something in common in that both of us sought out and joined the UNPO. And it's ironic, to say the least, that an international organization from The Hague advocating for human rights of so many of the world's most oppressed people would find a home for those of us in the capital of the United States, a nation looked at around the world by many as a beacon of hope and inspiration for freedom and democracy. And because so many of the UNPO members count on support from the United States in their struggles against oppression, I think it was very principled and perhaps a little brave of them to welcome the capital of the United States into this organization. When we joined, we were accused almost of making light of the sufferings of people in places like Baluchistan, the Uyghurs of China, folks who are far more oppressed and face far more discrimination than the citizens of the District of Columbia. But this is the unrepresented nations and peoples. In an international law, just as other aspects of law, there are different kinds of crimes. There are horrific felonies, and there are the occasional misdemeanor. And perhaps when you compare the status of the District of Columbia to the suffering and horrible violence you're going to hear about today, our struggle may seem trivial. But if you're committed to fairness, if you're committed to equality, then you have to address injustice and the lack of equity wherever you find it. And sadly, we find it here, in this very capital of the United States, in the shadow of a dome, where hopefully the cries and pleas of the Baluch will be heard and get the appropriate attention that it deserves, but at the same time, based largely on a tradition that stems from the district status as a home to ethnic minorities here in the United States. And it's not the only one. But let's remember that in the United States, every jurisdiction currently, which has a majority population that is a demographically ethnic minority, I'm also talking about Puerto Rico, I'm talking about the U.S. Virgin Islands, I'm talking about Guam, American Samoa, all lack voting representation in our national legislature. They elect non-voting delegates, resident commissioners, people with various titles. But none of them are allowed to cast a vote. And from that political disempowerment stems all of the injustices that you might find as well. And so right now, the lack of economic justice for Puerto Rico is prominent in people's minds, as it should be. We see that same pattern in the Virgin Islands. And we in the District of Columbia continue to labor under the problem of taxation without representation. And so I'm proud to be here to welcome all of you for this important discussion, and as a UNPO member to be here with my president, and thank so many other Washingtonians for coming out and learning all about this. When we unite, regardless of the differences in our various struggles, we are of course stronger together, and I appreciate this opportunity to share this with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. A, for coming here, and then B, for reminding us that even though these cases at first glance might not have anything in common, that in fact they do, and of reminding us of the issue of representation and self-determination. I would now show the short video statement by Baba Al-Mengar, who is based in London, and Mr. Kumar is joining us.
First of all, I'm grateful to all of you for your participation on this important topic concerning Baluchistan and showing solidarity with the Baluch nation, a nation that needs people like us to become a voice for them in the international community, a nation that remains unheard as it tries for justice, a nation that faces unprecedented levels of oppression on a daily basis. As most of you know, Pakistan's oppression of the Baluch nation dates back 7 decades. Since 1948, Pakistan has seen Baluchistan as an opportunity to loot and plunder the nation's resources for as long as it can, and to eliminate anyone that stands in its way. Not only anyone who poses an illegal occupation, but also anyone who believes that the Baluch people have a right to live, the right to feed off their own land, and the right to educate themselves. Which is why the Baluch people have seen decades of military operations and brutalities at the hands of the Pakistani army. Now, to add to all that's happening, China has decided to jump in and take part in the loot and plunder of the Baluch land. We see China's CPEC project as an extension of what we have faced since the last 7 decades. Pakistan was already involved in exploitation of Baluchistan, but China has pushed its opportunities to levels it previously could not afford. Everything that has been happening in Baluchistan since the last 70 years has basically moved to a larger scale, which means intensified military operations, intensified exploitation projects, and more importantly, an intensified effort from Pakistan and China to eradicate the Baluch people from their homeland. All of this will carry on. It will carry on for as long as the international community and Western powers turn a blind eye towards Baluchistan and its people. It will carry on till the world wakes up and says, enough is enough, the Baluch people have a right to live. Now, the Baluch nation appreciates President Trump's stance on Pakistan. Recognizing Pakistan for what it is and what it has been is in the best interest of not only the US but the entire world. But the fact that Pakistan has yet not been held accountable for using aid from the West against the West is astonishing. Somehow Pakistan has been able to use its blackmailing tactics around the world, and surprisingly, it has worked for them. Recently, there were free Baluchistan posters displayed in Geneva, after which the Pakistani army held protests against the West and burned Western flags. This is something Pakistan has always done and somehow gotten away with. Now, the reason the US invaded Afghanistan was because the Taliban regime had refused to hand over Osama bin Laden. Whereas later, Osama was found and killed next to the Pakistan military headquarters near his capital, and the person who helped in the operation was arrested by the Pakistan military. For some reason, the world seems to look past this fact like it never happened. This by itself was enough reason to declare Pakistan a state sponsor of terrorism and hold it accountable for what it did. Not to mention its open support for multiple, if not all, extremist groups that operate on the sole basis of hatred against the West. Lastly, I would like to say to the international community that it should stand up in the face of terror, stand up for humanity, stand up for the rights of the Baluch people, and if not for the Baluch people, then stand up for the world and recognize Pakistan for what it is and the threat it poses to world peace. I urge the international community to get to it before it gets to each one of you. Thank you.
Thank you to Bawao. I'm sure he's on the Facebook live stream, so thank you for that. And I would like to welcome Tikuma. We're honored to have you on this panel. And with this, I would close the opening remarks, and we would now go over to the contributions by Christine Fair and Tikuma, and we would start with you, Christine. So Christine Fair is an associate professor in the Peace and Security Studies program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She previously worked at a number of other think tanks, among them the RAND Corporation, and then also she is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Political Science Association, and the American Institute of Pakistan Studies. She is a frequent commentator on television and radio, including the BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, and the Voice of America, and has also given interviews to journalists with the New York Times, Washington Post, and Time Magazine, to just name a few. And with this, I would give over to you.
Okay, awesome.
You might want to, yeah.
What is it? I think it's on.
Yeah.
Thank you for your comment, Senator Strauss. I'd also like to point out that about 80% of Americans have 20% of the senators, and 20% of Americans have 80% of the senators. We also have massively gerrymandered districts, which privilege one party in particular. We have very aggressive efforts to suppress voters, and we have what people will call the Electoral College, but which I call the slave state college, because its origins are so horrific and problematic. So I think we could actually have a fairly sustained dialogue and a democracy and governance program centered on our democracy and governance programs. Oh, and that's leaving aside the criminal, sexual assailant, racist, Nazi defending individual occupying the White House. So I actually see a lot of commonalities between the United States and Pakistan. So I'm going to situate my presentation a little bit differently. I am a scholar of Pakistan. I am not a human rights activist. As I say frequently at events like this, I don't defend changing borders of states by blood. However, like many people that study South Asia and don't worry about getting a visa for Pakistan, I am very concerned about the human rights violations that are ongoing in Balochistan. And I think more problematically for Americans is that even though Pakistan has continued to engage in human rights violations, not only in Balochistan, by the way, but also throughout the federally administered tribal areas, Pakistan is doing so with our dollars and in many cases our weapons. And we actually have laws that are supposed to prevent this, most prominently the Leahy Amendment, which is supposed to preclude this kind of assistance going to any unit of a security force that engages in these human rights abuses. Unfortunately, that law is very difficult to implement and is largely honored in this breach. So with that premise, I'm going to try to focus my discussion today on the data that looks at the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor. I want to leave you with a little bit of an understanding of what it really is, vice what people will say it is. So I think it's important to sort of situate, and if I had one of these laser pointers, I would point this out, but you see, if you're not blind like I am, this label, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which at least in this pictograph moves mostly north to south. But it's not to be seen in isolation. It's actually part of a much larger complex of 6 economic corridors that traverse Asia, Europe, and Africa. So this is just one piece of China's strategy. This is a closer zoom in of the different competing trade corridors in Asia. The southern corridor is essentially the China-Pakistan economic corridor. One thing I'd like to point out is that the book by Andrew Small on China-Pakistan relations is, in my opinion, the book to read on this subject. He speaks Chinese, he spent a lot of time in the region, he knows the issue really quite well. And he presents an interesting factoid. And that is, if you can see Kashgar on the map, which is in China's Xinjiang province, which very much worries China because of the Uyghur situation, and Gwadar port, it actually takes about 6 times as much to move a barrel of crude through this corridor than any of the other corridors that connect inland China to a sea. So this raises very important questions about the economic viability of this corridor and what the objective is. And this is going to be one of the questions that I seek to address in this conversation. This map, now what's fascinating about CPEC, which I actually call colonizing Pakistan to enrich China, is that there's very little public information about it. And this is very much in keeping with the Chinese so-called economic development business model. And I think Pakistan should perhaps be taking a very close look at what the Chinese did in Sri Lanka. So the way in which China works is that it decides it's going to build a project. It primarily uses its labor. It primarily uses its exports. And it sets a price. This is not a price that's settled through a market. It's not a price that's settled through an RFP. It's not a price that has any market transparency. So it basically initially generates most of the economic gains, and it saddles the country in which it operates with the debt. And what we've seen in Sri Lanka, for example, with the Hambantota port, is that the debt that Sri Lanka was saddled with was way in excess of the value of the port. And so essentially Sri Lanka is unable to make even the recurring payments on that debt servicing. And one of the ways that China has offered Sri Lanka to escape this burden of debt, and by the way, that's just one project, is that it says, well, just give us the land. So this is a very aggressive form of colonization. And this is not something that Pakistanis should be looking at as a measure of Chinese friendship, which is how the elites would like to characterize this. And there's a reason why the elites would like to characterize this, is that the elites are basically going to divide up the rents. So we can see this in Sri Lanka. This is one of the reasons why the price of Chinese investment was so high, is that the political elites took a very, very large sum for themselves. and then pass this on to their taxpayer. So in essence, Chinese investments in this model is a very productive way of transferring money from the public to private pockets, and it's done so without accountability. And so I think this should raise an important question for the Trump administration, because I actually don't think President Trump is going to be any more capable of handling the Pakistan problem than previous administrations who were far more competent generally, and specifically had far more competent foreign policy professionals working complex issues. I think one thing that the Americans are going to have to consider very heavily is our continued support of Pakistan at the IMF. Because what will happen is that the primary donors to the IMF, which is the American taxpayer, we are actually going to be the ones servicing the debt that Pakistan is in hock to for China. So in other words, this is another example of the Pakistani elites taking advantage of a situation, knowing full well that the American taxpayer and other international contributors to IMF are going to bail them out. So this is what we would call formally a moral hazard, literally a moral hazard, and we can talk about other aspects of the moral hazard as well. So in keeping with the lack of market transparency, there is no official document that lays out what CPEC is. Pakistan's own state bank has called for more information. So I want you to let that sink in for a second. Pakistan's own state bank doesn't know what CPEC is, doesn't understand the pricing, it doesn't understand what the actual sub-projects are going to be. So when the State Bank of Pakistan is asking for more information and is not getting it from either the political or the military elites, imagine the quality of information that the average Pakistani is obtaining. And if we have at the very end of my presentation, I'm going to show you some of the very clever private public PR campaigns that the Pakistani and Chinese state is engaging in to try to get buy-in for what is, as far as I'm concerned, an economic opportunity to rip off the Pakistani taxpayers with the international community underwriting that bill in substantial measure. But in principle, the map that I've shown you here, along with the flowing praises for the concept by both governments, of course this is no longer, Nawaz Sharif is no longer the Prime Minister of Pakistan, but this is a map that is at least nominally being passed around as viable. What I'd like to draw your attention to is some of these road alignments are pretty much impossible. So I think most of us would agree that this road, I think it's labeled 621, that's going through Baluchistan, the likelihood of that road actually happening is very low. And the reason for that is that would probably actually benefit the Baloch. Another reason why it's actually quite low of being a full-fledged navigable road, as it would appear on this map, comparable to other roads in the country, is that Balochistan is also undergoing a very fractious insurgency. And I'm not going to pretend that Baloch insurgent groups are always the victims here. I have followed this issue closely. There is no innocent party in Balochistan. You can look at the Punjabi corpses that are lining up in Balochistan. There's no reason to kill a Punjabi female teacher. And this idea that they're colonizers makes no sense to me. If I want to move to Montana, I'm not a colonizer, I'm a citizen. So I think the very language that's used in this discussion undermines some of the very severe tensions that exist between Balochistan and the center. But I'm going to, and much of those tensions are kind of, at least at the political end of the stick, motivating the political discord about the alignment of these projects. One thing I would like to point out, in the United States, and even in other parts of Asia, it may not be appreciated how little value added is to be had from building a road. Right? So we often think about roads build commerce. But if any of you have been on these various motorways in Pakistan, they're actually commerce killers. Right? What these roads are is to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible. So they're really benefiting the commercial traffickers in the country. If you were to compare your experience on the motorway that used to link up, and still kind of does, but no one uses it, between Lahore and Islamabad, the GT road, the road that everyone used, going back to the time of the British, there were businesses all along that road. You had dhabas, you had truck servicing centers, you had tire repair because you always blew your tires out because the road was so lousy. These were, in fact, small business generating lines of communication. When the motorway went in, you never saw that kind of commerce happening. And of course, one of the biggest debates about where these motorways go is the land through which they cut. So what you instead get in these motorways are these conglomerated, plazas, where you'll have a gas station, a series of quasi-lousy restaurants, and a place where you can buy tchotchkes, and they would be distributed at relatively large lengths along the road. The other issue is that there's no emergency service provision. So if you have an accident on the motorway, chances are you're going to bleed out before anyone can get to you. So when we talk about road building, it's sometimes presented as a long-term economic investment, and it is, but we need to be really clear about who the beneficiaries are of these road building exercises. And in the short term, given that the Chinese tend to use their own labor, you really cannot say with a straight face that this is even job creating, even at the local level. So we need to be very clear-eyed that there are benefits that accrue, but the benefits are not going to be equally distributed, and they're certainly not going to benefit necessarily the people that live there locally, especially if it means that their land is displaced. Pakistan doesn't have this practice that the Americans have, by the way, which is providing you with the market value of the land that's confiscated for projects related to eminent domain. So there's a lot of issues of fairness, and a good deal of politicking happens with the alignments of these projects. So if we think about CPEC as a giant pipe, and going back to the larger question of, is this actually an economic corridor or an exploitative corridor, I think it's useful to think about CPEC in this way. In the north, we have a very large choke point. I've driven on this road, and this is the Karakoram Highway. It was actually built in the 60s. So many of the Indian concerns that CPEC will make permanent in arrangement, those concerns, they happened ages ago. The CPEC has been there for a number of decades, but the the Karakoram Highway is not really what it sounds like. So let me give you a little bit of a background of what the KKH is. So the KKH took decades to build because they were literally blowing up foothills of the Himalayas. And so consequently, the road tends to be very narrow, and I'm going to show you a few pictures in a few minutes. The roads are very narrow. Many of you, I can tell, have some experience in South Asia one way or another, because I know you from previous conversations. You know the jingle trucks. It's actually very difficult to get two vehicles on this road, and there's this elaborate dance that you have to do when you're on this road. And it tends to trace through the Himalayas. It's very perilous. There's just a number of ravines, and you really don't want to look to the side, because what you'll see in the ravine are previous buses and trucks that pass before you and careen into the ravine to their demise. And these are typically not falls that people survive. And they're also subjected to very frequent landslides. And the experience I had on the KKH was probably one of the most harrowing roads I've ever been on. And you'll be stranded on the road, there'll be a landslide, and your biggest concern is, are you going to be swept off by another landslide? The landslides are cleared relatively quickly by the National Logistics Cell, but if you're going to be having an economic corridor, these kinds of choke points are actually quite problematic. And what happened a number of years ago, you'll see here this Lake Athabad. This isn't actually a natural lake. This is actually a landslide that wiped off a large stretch of the KKH. And so in Pakistani ingenuity, they made it a lake, and very cleverly, I may add, and made it a draw for vacation. So if you Google Lake Athabad, you'll find some nice pictures of white people, women in sleeveless shirts, basking in the sun. I wonder how much security it took to take that picture, because this is not something that one would typically do on Lake Athabad, to put it mildly. So these are some of the pictures. So how do you get around this lake that was there? So what they did was that they built they built these barge locking areas, these barge docking areas, and you would put your trucks on these barges. And so I've got a couple of pictures here of how these transport vehicles as well as cars would be put on these barges to traverse Lake Athabad. Now, for those of you who know South Asia, you should know immediately what's wrong with those truck pictures. They're not full. They're empty, right? So this is what I'm going to call a photo op. Usually when you see these trucks, not only are they filled to the top, they usually have some kind of cloth over the truck, and you'll actually see, they'll just tip over because the center of gravity is so difficult to negotiate. So yet these trucks are curiously empty. I would hazard a guess that if you put 4 full jingle trucks on this barge, there's no way that that barge would go forward. So eventually what they were able to do with Chinese assistance is that they built this bridge to basically cross over Lake Athabad. So this was resolved in spring of 2015. However, this doesn't get away from problems elsewhere on the road, which you see here. So this is not a terribly uncommon passage, where you see these buses. Now what I want you to think about, how much effort is it going to take to make this road a viable economic corridor? And this is actually where the residents of Gilgit-Baltistan, right, because we often know about the Baloch grievances about CPEC, we very rarely hear about the grievances of those in Gilgit-Baltistan. They understand very well the amount of environmental devastation that will have to take place to make this a viable economic corridor. And there have been a number of protests against the state, and the state's response has been, as it is elsewhere, to violently repress those protests because Gilgit-Baltistan has a different constitutional dispensation than, say, the Punjab or even Baluchistan, where we know it's difficult to get journalists into Baluchistan. It's equally difficult to hear voices from Gilgit-Baltistan, and so very few people will even know that there have been violent protests about this. So it's not just the Baloch who are disenfranchised. So one of the things that the Chinese have been pursuing is that they've been encouraging the Pakistani state to convert Gilgit-Baltistan, which used to be known previously as the northern areas, into a regular province. And some Gilgit-Baltistanis want this, others oppose it. This is a very similar debate, by the way, about what Pakistanis call Azad Kashmir, what Indians call Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. Because the Gilgit-Baltistan, like Kashmir, is embroiled in this larger Kashmir dispute, turning these areas into a regular state will in some sense nullify Pakistan's position on Kashmir, and so there is a larger discussion. But the very fact that the Pakistanis are considering this, not from an indigenous demand for statehood, but rather from an external demand from the Chinese to make it easier for them to manage the Gilgit-Baltistani grievances, I think is really important and says quite a bit about the motivation of the CPEC. The political constraints, I think I've talked about previously. There's a lot of negotiation about where new roads will go, and so many of the things that's happening in the northern chokehold are actually even more hotly debated in the Punjab because the stakes are so much higher and you have much more leeway to expand these roads as well as to make spurs and to connect them to other roads. For reasons that should be obvious, you have fewer opportunities for these kinds of realignments in Gilgit-Baltistan, if for no other reason than geography. So the southern choke point is actually Gwadar. So a couple of years ago, this is a really brave piece that was published in the Dawn. The Pakistanis have gotten very good at war tourism. You can always tell one of these so-called think tank analysts, like Michael Kugelman, I can go on at length, journalists, both Peer, Zubair Shah, and I have been on these Pakistani war tourism dog and pony shows, as have many of our senators and House of Representatives. And if you don't know Urdu, if you can't read Urdu, it is very easy to be lied by these guys. I mean, Pakistanis to quote my mother, they can put chocolate on a turd and tell you it's a donut. And if you're not completely on the ball, you will take a bite of that donut. And you might even say, God, that was an off-tasting donut. But it wouldn't occur to you what the thing actually was. I've seen this with Codels that go to Pakistan. Even people as wizened, thoughtful, and historically knowledgeable as Senator McCain is consistently swayed by these Pakistani boondoggles. When he comes back from a Codel, you think Pakistan had been our best partner, as opposed to a country that's taken 33 plus billion and has largely facilitated the murder of our troops and allies in Afghanistan. But you'd never know that looking at people that go on these Codels. So Pakistan's intelligence agency did something very curious. They actually arranged a bunch of journalists to go to Gwadar, thinking that they would have the same influence upon domestic journalists as it does upon international journalists. And the whole premise of this, by the way, this is why I suspect that one of our speakers that was scheduled today may have canceled. The Pakistanis use influence and access to coerce the kinds of things that they want from you. They're exceptional at this. If you speak against the Pakistani state, as I do frequently, they won't give you a visa. In fact, they've even threatened me with gang rape. This is what they do. If you say what they don't want you to say, they restrict your access. In contrast, if you continue to be mealy-mouthed about what they do, it doesn't matter if you're a junior assistant to associate moron, you will still get to see the ISI chief, right? So this kind of access in a town like this goes very far. So they tried a method that has been very effective at coercing positive knowledge production from think tank analysts, journalists, and even scholars, especially junior scholars that don't have tenure. This kind of access they think is very important for writing books and papers. So they tried to do this with the Pakistani journalist. It was supposed to be a 3-part story on Gwadar. Not surprisingly, only one part was published. The other 2 parts had nothing to do with Gwadar. But the first part that did get published was really quite brave and remarkable. And that's actually where these pictures came from. He noted that what was remarkably absent at Gwadar was a thing called ships. You can see that in the pictures. And if you're building a deep water port, ships are kind of a good thing to have because that is kind of the point. And he talked about the extensive security. He talked about the Chinese presence. He talked about it felt as if this was no longer a piece of Pakistan. And I kept waiting for parts 2 and part 3 from his Gwadar report, and instead he went on to report other things from the war tourism. And anyone who knows how the Pakistani press works, you know exactly what went down. I will bet anything that he was told explicitly, you got your 1 piece off, don't even think about 2 more pieces on Gwadar. The Pakistanis are just that sensitive about this issue. And I think they've got good reason to be sensitive because what's happening is not going to benefit the Pakistanis, and it's certainly not going to benefit the Baloch who live there. So let's talk about some of the concerns that Baloch harbor in Balochistan, and then let's also talk about some of the strategies that the Pakistani state has deployed to manage these concerns. Well, Baloch naturally fear that they're going to become a minority in their own province. Now, by the way, I actually think that's already true. We haven't had a census in Pakistan since 1998. That census itself was deeply politicized and was supposed to have taken place in 1981. And it was politicized because of the refugee crisis from the war that was taking place in Afghanistan. And of course, we've had similar refugee issues in Pakistan for reasons that I think should be obvious. One of the areas where the Afghan refugees have congregated have actually been Baluchistan. So the eponymous Shura of the Taliban is called the Quetta Shura for a reason. It's based in Quetta. And you've had long-standing refugee camps, which are largely ethnic Pashtuns, and I also want to say very clearly from a historical point of view, Pashtuns have always been there. So sometimes you'll see these very misleading maps that Balochistan is just for Baloch. That's actually not true because we have censuses going back from the time of British management that shows a very healthy Pashtun population in Balochistan for, well, as long as we've had censuses. So Balochistan is what I would call a lumpy soup, right? To get an idea of everyone that's in that soup, you have to take a lot of bites because the populations are concentrated in very specific places, and the populations are concentrated by ethnic groups. And sometimes you'll see very good maps that show the distribution of different places. But one of the things that's happened with CPEC, and it's not just CPEC, many of you know that the relationship between Baluchistan and the center have been fractious since 1947. Khan of Kalat initially agreed to join Pakistan, but the Khan of Kalat did not, that mandate did not pertain to all of Balochistan, and then he changed his mind, and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, very early on, the state went into Balochistan and forcibly took it. It became a problem again after the 1971 war. Under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, there have been periods of peace, and there's also been periods of restiveness. And we are currently in a period of restiveness going back to 2005, when a female doctor was raped by a Pakistan army officer. And some of you may remember President Musharraf, the so-called liberal feminist, coming here and mocking this woman, saying that she was getting visas and so forth, and otherwise benefiting from her potentially gang rape experience. So that was the moderator, President Pervez Musharraf. So since 2005, the state has been very much focused upon Balochistan. But it should be noted that even before 2005, Balochistan has been a victim of extraction by the Pakistani state. Balochistan has gas, it has minerals, and just by virtue of coming from Balochistan, the state pays a lower price for that gas than it does gas from neighboring Sindh. Now I want you to let that sit in for a moment. What the Pakistani state will say to justify this is that it's logistically more difficult to get that gas from Balochistan, and therefore they should have to pay less for it. That's not how the market works, right, ladies and gentlemen? Baloch will also note that even though that gas is coming from Balochistan, that gas does not go to their homes. So even if you look at Pakistan's own survey data, such as the Household Integrated Economic Survey and the Pakistan Standard of Living Measurement Survey, we see across the board measurements of infrastructure, for example, flushable toilets, potable water, electricity hookups, as well as human development measures in Balochistan that are consistently lower than any other place in Pakistan, controlling for rural and urban status. So essentially, Balochistan is an area that the state has been exploiting for some time. And they get away with this because while Balochistan is about 40% of Pakistan's physical territory, they're only 5% of the population. And Pakistanis are like Americans in the sense that they don't know what's going on elsewhere in the world, much less their own state. The BBC did this fabulous interview with Punjabis. They went through a Narkali bazaar and they asked, did you know that there's a conflict going on in Balochistan? And the most typical response to this, Balochistan, wo hai kidhar? Where is Balochistan? Awkward moment, but I think some Americans would probably fail that test as well. So the Pakistani state bears no punishment for what it has been able to do in Balochistan. And it's kind of similar in the United States. For example, our representation is based upon our population. So Balochistan will have no representation proportionately in the House, in the equivalent of their House of Representatives. Like the United States system, Senate has equal representation. They have the same number of senators as someone in the Punjab has. However, in Pakistan, the Senate has no power. In our system, it's just the other way around. I mean, our Senate controls many things, including Supreme Court nominations. So it's been very easy for the Pakistani state to exploit Balochistan, and it's very difficult for anyone to impose costs upon the state. And when you have a situation like this, this is when non-state actors arise. And the international community has never cared about Balochistan, and for reasons that, we don't care about the Rohingyas either. And the Rohingyas are absolutely suffering a genocide, and they've been suffering a genocide for decades. So it's very difficult to get the international community to care about a people like this. But the point that I would make as an American is that it's not like the Rohingyas. We're not subsidizing the genocide of Rohingyas. We are subsidizing what's happening in Balochistan, both through our security assistance, through our coalition support funds, Because we've also been very happy, by the way, through Pakistan's developed mechanism of disappearing people. Like, we benefited from this, from Guantanamo. So as an American, I can't simply say this is not my problem, because it is my problem, because my money is helping to make this problem. And I think our policymakers have an obligation to not make this a football bat. But this is right now a football bat, and the American taxpayer is contributing to it. So the other issue that's happening in Balochistan, and it's very similar to what's happening in Gilgit-Baltistan, except we don't have a Gilgit-Baltistan set of organizations like the Baloch have, we haven't heard about it as much, is that there is a pretty significant lack of human capital. And so the Pakistani state can say, well, we're bringing in so-called, what Baloch will call colonizers, because we need to replace this human capital. And this will take place at the level of the police forces. This will take place at the level of teachers. It's also going to take place with some of the business activities that are allegedly associated with building Gwadar and CPEC. So the state now has a problem, right? The state knows that Baloch are never going to succumb to this project. And nor, by the way, will the Baloch ever win. Nor will the Baloch ever come to some sort of condominium of rent sharing with the Pakistani state, whereby let's just divide the spoils more evenly and y'all can get on your way with exploiting. So the kind of situation that has been very satisfactory in the Punjab and Sindh, and even in the KPK, is not going to happen in Balochistan. So how does the state manage this? Particularly since Baloch say that they're secular. So when you read the statements of various Baloch leaders, they will say to Americans, you should be supporting us because we're the only ones that are secular in the region. Now, whether or not Baloch were or are secular, I've got evidence to say that they aren't. Whether or not they were is a different issue. But how the Pakistanis have managed this is really quite extraordinary. They have used internal colonization of Islamist organizations. So I've done a lot of work on madrasas, for example, which are primarily, in the case of Balochistan, Sunni religious seminaries. So believe it or not, Balochistan, for being a secular state, has some of the highest enrollment in madrasas. And you can plot where these madrasas are. Vali Nasser has described these madrasas as forming a wall on the Iranian border, because Iran, of course, is Shia, and Pakistan has long viewed the influence of Shia in Iran. The other thing that they've done, which is particularly pernicious, is that they have relied upon Jamaat al-Dawa and its various front organizations to colonize Balochistan ideologically. There's this fabulous quote I have in my book that's coming out on Lashkar-e-Taiba, where Hafiz Saeed says we're the only ones that can fix Balochistan, because once the Baloch appreciate the two-nation theory in the ideology of Pakistan, they'll become a part of the state. So in other words, Hafiz Saeed is saying that he is going to do what the Pakistan state has not been able to do. And during humanitarian disasters, so for example, the devastating earthquake that occurred a few years ago, the state would not let in international organizations like MSF. It wouldn't even let in other domestic organizations. The sole provider of this security was FIF. Now, to make matters worse, I think from an international security point of view, I hope most of you know that this organization that's been designated as a foreign terrorist organization has recently been urged by the ISI to set up a political party. And they participated in the by-election that was going to replace the seat vacated by Nawaz Sharif. And given that they had just set up weeks before, they did really quite well. I think they actually did better than the PPP in that election. And it's also notable that the political leadership was educated at Pakistan's National Defense University. So the idea that this is just sort of some sui generis idea that Hafiz Saeed, cooked up while thinking about ways to blow up India is something that we can probably dismiss out of hand. This is probably something that he himself did not come up with. So the state's been very active, and I actually have evidence that suggests that the state's active efforts, at least going back to the 1980s, to use political Islam to suppress ethnic Baloch aspirations has been helpful. A number of years ago, I did a large survey of Pakistan, over 14,000 persons, and we oversampled Baluchistan. I'm not going to, I've been talking too long, I want to shut up and get onto a slide that might be more helpful. So we looked at, and you can see in Baluchistan we had a little bit over 2,000 people. By the way, that's more than what Pew will typically have for the whole country. So this is a very large sample, especially given the low population size of Baloch. So we asked some basic questions comparing Baloch versus non-Baloch in Baluchistan, comparing Baloch and non-Baloch across the country, and comparing specifically Baloch to Punjabis. And what we see when we ask them, do you care about liberating Kashmiris from Indian rule? Baloch don't look that much different from any other Pakistani, whether we're looking within Balochistan or we're comparing them with others outside of Pakistan. When we ask about protecting Muslims from Kashmir, beyond Kashmir from Hindu oppression, which is a very standard Pakistani talking point, again, Baloch don't look any different than Pakistanis elsewhere. When we ask whether or not they think that Pakistan should be made Sharia compliant, we see very few differences. And by the way, the numbers are actually quite high for that number. This is on a 5-point scale. So on average, people are coming in at about 4.4, 4.5. Ridding Pakistan of apostates and hypocrites. Again, the numbers are really similar, whether we're looking at Baloch or non-Baloch. And even when we look at support for terrorist groups like Sipe-e-Sabe Pakistan in the Afghan Taliban, this is actually where we see some notable differences. Non-Baloch in Balochistan are much more likely to support the Afghan Taliban, and that's not surprising because of the Pashtun demographic. But when we compare Baloch to everyone else across the country, i.e. not simply comparing them within the province of Balochistan themselves, again, they begin to look like everyone else. And very similarly, support for SSP is actually higher among Baloch than it is non-Baloch. And this is important because the SSP is the organization that have been killing the Hazara Shias in Balochistan. So when I look at these data, I can't say what existed before because there's never been a survey done like this before in Balochistan. But what I can say as of today, I don't see a lot of evidence that the Baloch are this magical secular force that Baloch leadership keep telling Americans. So in conclusion, when we look at CPAC, I think when you look at the data, it's difficult to make the case that this is an economic corridor. Most of the projects are going to be subject to security constraints, and how Pakistan is going to resolve this is through massive human rights violations. Believe you me, my Baloch friends, the Pakistan army will kill every single one of you to make Balochistan safe for Chinese exploitation. And the international community is not going to run to your defense. I think in making your decisions about how you're going to handle this, you need to be very clear-eyed. Nor are you going to be able to defeat one of the largest armies in the world. And whether the Americans like the Pakistanis or not, the Americans are not going to support any sort of changing borders of a nuclear armed country. This is just not in the realm of political science ever going to happen. The way this is going to be handled is through massive human rights violations. There's already discussions of the Chinese sending Marines to Balochistan. I've got pictures of Chinese Marines marching side by side with Pak Army. And of course, they're setting up the CPEC security force. And the political constraints are also going to bind it. But there might be some low-hanging fruit, but the low-hanging fruit is going to come at a high price. So we all know that Pakistan has this circular debt problem with energy generation. Pakistan's problem is not energy generation, it's energy theft, it's poor pricing. And the energy that is currently produced has to embed in its price structure this enormous circular debt, so it produces energy that people can't afford. And then, of course, there's the distribution and the stealing. By the way, it should also be noted that Karachi's port capacity is underutilized. That's something I probably should have pointed out several minutes ago. So it raises another question of why do you need Gwadar Port when Karachi Port, which is well served by existing lines of communication, isn't anywhere near capacity. So the energy projects might be low-hanging fruit, but when you build in all of the security that's going to be required, it's not clear it's going to be any more affordable than the existing projects. No, by the way, unless you deal with transmission and pricing, the problem exists. economic zones might be realized, but you still have the electricity as well as political issues. There will probably be investments in road infrastructure, but is that going to have the benefits that everyone is saying it is? We're also now hearing that CPEC probably has a much larger agricultural component, where essentially China will be using Pakistan to grow some of its genetically modified agricultural products. We might see improvements in rail. The Chinese are talking about that, but it can't get any worse. The Chinese record is already pretty lousy on this. They tried to sell engines that didn't work, and then they had a problem with selling engines that were actually made for the wrong gauge in Pakistan, right? Because Pakistan has a different gauge than some of its neighbors. I think the biggest lesson that Pakistanis should really be drawing is the lessons that Sri Lanka affords. Sri Lanka offers a textbook way by which Sri Lankan public assets are turned into private assets with debt that is absolutely unserviceable and resolvable only by giving away deeds to land. So thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Christine. This was very helpful to get an idea of the geopolitics of what is happening in Baluchistan. Thank you, Senator Strauss. And I think a takeaway for me would be that already what is happening here in Baluchistan has an influence on, for example, research here in the US, and then whether or not you agree that the Baluch are secular people. I think if the state uses political Islam there, that would likely deteriorate the situation up to a point where potentially it would have effects even on people here in the US. To keep it short, I would give it over to Tikumar now. Just a very short introduction. He is with Amnesty International here in the US, and he served as a human rights monitor around the world and was the director of several refugee camps. He monitored several elections around the world with President Carter and the OSCE. And he was a political prisoner for over 5 years in his native Sri Lanka, and that's where he started his legal studies and also became a human rights activist. And with this, I would give over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting Amnesty International to participate in this event about discussing human rights abuses and issues in the province of Baluchistan in Pakistan. We have been, as an organization, we have been documenting human rights abuses around the world, in every country, including US, China, everywhere. That also includes Pakistan. In Pakistan, there are obviously 4 provinces, and abuses range from extrajudicial executions, that means police or military and killing people without any excuse or sometimes excuse but at their random. Second is imprisonment, torture and disappearance. Out of all these abuses, I would like to touch on the disappearance part, because it stands out as one of the cruelest form of abuse in human rights. Every abuse is cruel, by the way, but this has some extra pain, not only to the victims, but also the perpetrators, also the families. That's why we consider that this is one of the painful abuses a human being can undergo, is disappearance. I'll explain why. If a person disappears means that person been picked up by civilian officials and they will deny they have picked it up. The families will be running around looking for the loved one. The response will be, we don't know, we didn't pick up, why are you coming to us? So these families will be undergoing enormous emotional stress of what happened to this individual. Whether that person is alive, whether that person is dead. If also most of the families, almost 90 exclusively, they will refuse to accept that person had died. That's uniform, because families never believe that their loved person had died because there is no proof. So they will have at least 1% hope that they will find their loved one. That's the family side. On the victim side, he or she will be in a place unknown to anyone, and they are at the mercy of abuses committed by the captors, security forces, police and others. That means they can chop off your fingers, they can rape you, they can do whatever they like, because there is no one. You are not accountable, you are just holding them. And if you get killed or if you die, they just dump the body, drop the body somewhere else and finish it off. That's a standard disappearance practice around the world. It happened against political opponents. It happens against ethnic or religious minorities when they ask for justice or when they ask for political rights. We don't take a position on political issues, whether the country or the province should be an independent country. We only focus on the abuses per se. So when you look at Pakistan, out of all the 4 provinces, the disappearance is far, far more advanced, or more people have disappeared and disappearing in the province of Baluchistan. And other abuses happen, disappearance happen in Sindh, Punjab and other places, and the reaction from the security forces and the police, which is also different. I mean, with the victims' families. One example I still vividly remember the picture. One 11-year-old son was demonstrating along with some other people in Punjab. I think that family must be from Punjab, for the disappearance of the father. So what the police did was they went and stripped him naked, basically humiliated him. That is, not only you do something, but if the child is coming and asking, where is my dad? At least let the child cry. You just humiliated that child, and I saw the picture, his trousers being removed. So the brutality of the abuses goes beyond any imagination in many parts of the world. And the abuses happening in the region, Baluchistan never get attention for what it has gone through all these years and still going through. That's why events like this is extremely important to keep the attention going. I know now we are seeing a lot of events on Baluchistan coming up. That's important. So what's happening in Baluchistan is, from the human rights point of view, as I mentioned earlier, all the other abuses are happening. Torture, extrajudicial executions, imprisonment, all these things. Disappearance is something happening is slightly different from other parts of the world. It's that here, the forces never hide themselves. In other countries, they will go in civilian clothes. These guys go in uniform, in front of everyone. They don't care. Grab the people, take them, and families will never be able to see these people. Bodies occasionally shows up in streets with severe torture marks. It's called kill and dump operation. You have disappeared this person, but they threw this body to terrorize the local population. The terrorize the local population is that keep your mouth shut. Don't ask for any rights. It could be political rights, it could be any civil rights, any rights. You have to keep your mouth shut. If you open up your mouth or try to be little active, look, this will happen to you. Then the other aspect of it is the families also is scared to tell what happened. That's why we are unable to get full number figures about how many have disappeared, at least a ballpark figures. The reason is they are fearful that if they speak up, the loved one may get harmed. That loved one may have been killed by now, but I told you the human psychology, human belief is that even at the last minute, even after years and years and years goes by, they will never believe the son, daughter, husband, whatever have this is dead. Because they didn't see the body, they still have this 1% of hope. So they won't complain, they won't come out. Other fear, of course, is that some of their family members who are back home may be kidnapped and disappear. The government obviously and vehemently deny that they are responsible, even though we have proof that uniformed officers have kidnapped them, kidnapped in front of multiple witnesses, independent from the family, outsiders. They will say, no, we don't know what happened. That means the sense of the brutality goes beyond limit. The other aspect here is when people disappear, families also occasionally have these marches. There is one family, a group of family members who march from Baluchistan to Lahore, that's the capital, Lahore or Islamabad. And they were completely abused and harassed on their way. So that's why this particular issue of harassment, of abuse and disappearances is an extremely disturbing factor. And the reaction from the Pakistani government, no matter which government is in power, by the way, they don't care. They kind of ignore it. So this particular province, and especially the people of Baluchistan, I am talking about there are other ethnic groups, but the Baluch ethnic identity, people who belong to the Baluch ethnic people are the ones who are facing this music more intensely. There is one incident that made things even worse. Not worse, it brought another dimension to the war, where why US is silent, why US looks the other way, is the incident happened in the military. Medical doctor Christine Fair just mentioned briefly about that. A medical doctor, she is from Sindh. She is not even Baluch, she was working as a medical doctor in the military hospital. And she alleges she was raped by some captains or some senior officers. She knew that if she goes to the military high command, that justice is not going to be done. So she went and complained to the local tribal leader, a Bhukti, or elderly leader. And it's a tribal custom, so he basically, even though she is not from their own tribe or ethnic group, he took it upon that it happened in their province, in their area. So he sent word to the military to give 3 or 4 days time to bring the culprit to justice. And military ignored it. So the Baluch, under his command, started attacking. So this incident evolved into, there was an attempt on Musharraf flying over and his helicopter was attacked, or attempted attack. So it evolved into a massive abuses, because they went after the whole population. And eventually, the battle was going on between both sides. And eventually, Bhukti was hiding in a cave and he was killed. Where the US angle comes here is that the bombs that were used was a very powerful bunker busting bombs that were given to Pakistan to track down bin Laden and to finish him off. But they did not use it. They actually had him, where he was when he was killed. But they used it against their own people. That's what the interesting part. Pakistani government administration claim that Baluchis are their own citizens, their own people. They are not outsiders from their perspective. Baluch may think differently, that's a different story, but they claim against their own children, own family, own people, in a brutal manner, where a weapon was given to you for some other reason and used it against your own people. The other weapons are also used, but this is an example. Another high-tech was given was listening devices, again to track down bin Laden. Pakistani military tracked down where he through the listening devices, very powerful listening devices. This issue was raised repeatedly. At that time, Musharraf was there. So they needed, US needed, depending on Musharraf, for so-called war on terror operations. So they kind of downplayed it. We really pushed them hard. We publicly made statements, humiliated them, or publicly asked questions. So it shows one thing. Baluch suffering from the human rights abuses have no friends to speak up. You see what's happening in Rohingya, we also speak up, everyone is speaking up because of the nature. This is protracted, this is happening, and nothing is happening. That's why events are important, and we have to keep on pushing and speak up and to bring the atrocities to everywhere, you and everywhere. Like Rohingya, believe me, we have been working on Rohingya. I still remember 2012 when Rohingyas was initially attacked. No one wanted to touch that. I had a press conference at the press club. The title was Burma's Forgotten People, Rohingya Muslim Minority. Because no one wanted to touch that, and it's a forgotten people at that time. Look what happened. With a spark, it came all over the world, a big issue. So the issue in Baluchistan will blow up if Pakistani government does not treat Baluch people as their own people, as they claim, and treat them with at least minimum protection of human rights. At least you stop these disappearance business in large scale and terrorize the population, because they feel they can do it and they are confident, and that's why they are continuing. Before I close, I just want to touch on two other issues in the province. One is the attacks on Shia. It's nothing to do with Baluch, it's so-called extremist, Islamic extremist groups that attack, and because we are talking about the province. The other one is attack on Punjabi settlers. Could be anyone. The accusations are that some armed groups are involved, Baluch. One thing people should recognize, you will lose moral superiority or moral right to speak about the abuses happening to you if you commit even the small minor issues, in this case, attack on Punjabis. These are civilians, they are not security forces. You are justified. I mean, if there's an armed struggle, then you can target. So we hope everyone in Baluchistan look at this, and international community look at this, and to make sure at least one point about disappearance, some actions can be taken to reduce the number, so that at least the families and the people can live with relative peace as of today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, T. Kumar. Yeah, I think it's terrible to hear that these crimes are happening more or less in broad daylight. So Pakistan is not even trying to cover this up. So I think that's why the events like these are all the way more important, and I thank you for your activism on speaking out on this whenever you can. We are running a little bit short on time, but we have a few minutes for questions if someone from the audience would like to add something. Yes, please.
Question from very good point, disappearances. In Baluchistan, we understand the violent the armed struggle. But in Sindh, there is no armed struggle or no violence or anything. Even human rights defender, recently in 3 or 4 months, more than 150 people are disappeared. Even human rights defender. Question is why they are Pakistani army, especially started from the Musharraf, but it is in Sindh province more accelerating the situation on the disappearance side. In 4 months, 150 people disappeared. I think because the Pakistani army trying to control it, they want to stop it. And but the question is from you, how or what should we do to create not just only attention, especially the US, no single hearing or briefing on disappearance happening in the US, create the attention or to stop, because Pakistan army is not listening to anyone. What should we do? My simple question.
And the same is happening in Pakhtunkhwa also. In Pashtun area, it is happening on a large scale, I will tell you. It is not coming to the news. 15,000 people are disappeared in the last 10 years, and more than 150,000 are killed in the last 10 years. There is special data, but nobody is thinking about it, nobody is raising question about it.
Yeah, first on Singh, we knew the disappearances, we didn't know the scale. You remember the medical doctor from Texas, if I'm not mistaken. He disappeared about 5 years, 6 years ago, Pakistani, you see. And fortunately, he was a US citizen. So we were able to push very hard at the US to say US citizen and then disappeared. As a result, after about 2 years, he reappeared. One of the very few cases around the world we have come across where people have reappeared. And we had him in our office, I don't know whether you were there, to speak about his experience. He's a medical doctor. So our main question was, how did you survive emotionally, mentally, without getting, becoming mentally? Because, everyone goes nuts. He said since he is a medical doctor, he understood the dynamics and he handled it. So the first question for you is, for your field is, obviously you work closely with other groups, is to bring attention. I was not aware. I knew some, but I didn't know the figure of 150. Hearings focuses community human rights groups have to push. On the Pashtun area, I didn't know about the disappearance. We are very worried about these drones.
Some days ago, there was a big demonstration of the ladies in Islamabad. Their kids are disappeared and they have no information about their whereabouts.
He's right, and not only that, the Pakistan army has completely flattened North and South Waziristan. I think the puzzling thing is that all the howling about drones, we never saw an IDP population caused by drones. But the IDPs produced by Pakistan military operations in the tribal areas.
Exactly.
I mean, in fact, almost at one point, all of South Waziristan and all of North Waziristan is gone. But the terror, and before they even launched the operations, if you were looking at ISPR's Twitter feed as I was, they kept saying, we're coming, hey terrorists, we're coming. They had months to relocate before Operation Zarb Vakwas commenced. And Haqqani activists, had already been located to Kuram and encouraged to go to Afghanistan. This has just been Operation Get Money from the United States. They've done this largely to get coalition support funds, nothing else. But as you're right, no one is talking about this.
They like to just, they ask you what.
And there is a great level of rape going on in Somalia.
Of course. It's the Pakistan army.
It is a fascist system. Fascist system is not in those areas. Absolutely fascist method there.
I would like to give some other people just an opportunity to ask some questions, but you can of course continue the discussion. Karim?
Yeah, I have two questions. One for Professor Fair and one for Mr. Kumar. Professor, I thought it was interesting, fascinating, the data. But I'm somewhat confused, is that, you know, you go back and forth, you say it's really a human rights issue because, like you said, I don't know if they have eminent domain or not, but someone is taking all these land and turning it into highways and, you know, people suffer. Do you think that should be the basis of, you know, Baluch nation is suffering all three countries, let's say in Pakistan, that should be the basis, or that, you know, we know on the other hand is the geopolitical rivalry between the US and China. China is not doing something different than Africa. China is a colonial power now, absolutely, there's no question about it, and they're colonizing Baluch people like they're colonizing other nations in Africa, and, you know, and that should be the basis that the U.S. should very strongly, you know, stand against Chinese intervention in this area. Or do you think, and that's why your data was everywhere, the U.S. has an interest. I mean, Pakistan is the creation of the Americans. Without the American support, and, you know, probably won't, you know, is it in the interest of the U.S. to turn it into a human rights issue, what goes on in this project, or the fact that Chinese are coming and colonizing all this, you know, Baluchistan, Pakistan? For Mr. Kumar, I have one question. You know, you mentioned about all this killing. Do you think all this killing equates to genocide of Pakistani people? If it is, why the Amnesty never mentioned that? So that, as you know, we all know, the international law, that's the only thing that Baluch people can have, to go to the international community and request intervention if it's a genocide. So when we're talking hundreds of thousands of people killed, and why is it not turned into a genocide, and why Amnesty, you know, is not taking up the issue?
So, I mean, to your question, so I'm not a human rights activist. That isn't my job. My activism is pertaining to my own country, where look around. We have a guy that's, you know, sexually assaults women and boasts about it in the White House, who denounces. Yeah. So I'm not a human rights activist. I'm a professor. My human rights activism is pertaining to this country, where we've got lots to fix. Right? We've got our own rape culture here. We have a president that boasts about assaulting women, who denounces an entire country as rapists and refuses to help our own citizens in a hurricane. So I'm not a human rights activist. I'm a professor. My activism is purely domestic. That's not my job to advocate on behalf of a situation. However, I think the larger question that you raise is quite interesting. One, this administration in particular is retrenching from human rights. It's withdrawn from several UN commitments. It's defunded programs that would allow the State Department to deal with human rights. And under Secretary of State Tillerson, we've just seen an entire retrenchment of diplomacy in general and desire to get rid of large parts of the State Department. That probably won't happen because Congress probably won't let it happen, but who knows? So human rights, the commitment that the United States has to human rights, I think in general has always been not genuine. I mean, the things that we will make a hue and cry about with respect to human rights are more political than they are the scale of the inhumanity. So our relationship with Cuba, we declared Cuba to be a state sponsor of terror, but not Pakistan, right? So these are political issues. They're not instrumented by measures that have really anything to do with the thing that we're looking at. But China is a really interesting player here, because my discussions with people in the U.S. government, there's a sense of let China have Pakistan. The Americans give Pakistan grant aid, not loan aid. So the relationship that Pakistan is going to have with China is going to be very different from the relationship that they've had with the United States. And there is a sense that maybe the Chinese will get the Pakistanis to do things that the Americans have been unable to. There's also a realism that there is financial fatigue in Afghanistan. And China right now is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, investors in Afghanistan. I say it hedging because they have the largest stake in the Anak copper field, but they've actually been able to make very little progress in that. The Afghans would like to recontract it, but they can't find another bidder. So there's this tension between the sort of strategic competition between the United States and China, particularly in the Asian Pacific and the Pacific Command Theater. But in Central Command, there's a lot more ambivalence in a sort of sense, maybe it would be better off if we just handed this problem over to China. So I think the Pakistanis are hoping that this CPEC is going to rattle Americans. Oh, the Chinese are going to, displace you. There are a lot of Americans that say, let China have it, let China get stabbed in the back for a while. So this competition that the Pakistanis have been hoping to generate, it's just not going to materialize.
They're playing that card, Pakistan.
They're playing it, but not well.
Just to give a few words for Mr. Jikumar, because
on the genocide, it's no one had called what's happening in Pakistan. The genocide or what's happening to Rohingyas genocide. That requirement is very high, and every legal department, from the State Department to organizations, they all felt the high standard. There are a lot of tests you had to pass. That's why it was not good. But even without calling, we can bring a lot of attention by advocating and shouting and doing stuff. For example, Rohingya today there was a hearing. State Department was put on the spot by the members of Congress. It's a full committee hearing. State Department is also still refusing to call it ethnic cleansing. He was a poor guy, Assistant Secretary, Deputy Assistant Secretary, was trying to avoid by using that term because that's not the order we will see. So he was playing around with words. We all are calling, but the State Department did not. The reasons, the legal reasons, they are still checking. Thank you.
We have to come to an end. I would give the last few words to Nasser, as he's the only Baluch on this panel. So, go ahead, Nasser.
Well, I thank Sati for this evening and Christina for a good, informative discussion and presentation. But I want to comment about the secularism at Baluch. Of course, we Baluch have been struggling against both Iran and Pakistan when it's come to investment in Islamic culture. And if many in the US maybe supported Iranian Shah as a secular, but he also invested in Baluchistan in the mosques. It was to use this Islam against communism at the same time to break up, that's to say, to find, instead of developing a democracy in the region, political party, when the tribal system was disappearing, he wanted the mullahs to replace the Khans in Baluchistan, the Shah of Iran, because he thought they would be his kind of allies against the communism. The same thing would go with Pakistan. Pakistan also, it was the Carnegie Endowment for Peace some years ago wrote an article that Pakistan invests about, I think, 10 times more in Islamic school, through the Islamic Guidance Ministry in Baluchistan than its ordinary education. And as true as this is, then of course anybody asks those mosque children that are going to those school madrasas that are financed by the Pakistan, then they would have the same feeling that Pakistani has about the Kashmir issue. And this is, we have been struggling, but the thing is that as I was saying, this is a struggle that we have in common. As the US interfered in Afghanistan, brought the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviet at the time, and left us alone to face them. In Baluchistan.
That historically isn't true. So Zulfikar Ali Bhutto began this in...
Yes, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto started, but then it was...
1974.
Yes, of course.
Didn't start funding it until 82. Is it a big historical...
Yes, but this has been accelerated during that time. It has been accelerated during that time. And it is still that we see that one, for instance, from some regional other kind of rich countries in the region also, there are investment in the school and the mosque, and they are also protected by the West to some extent. And this is what we are saying. We have to stop. Of course, Islam, we are for freedom of religion. Islam is our religion, but Islam should be a personal thing. It should not be a governing thing. It should not be a political thing that should be used. And for instance, look at Iraq. When the US goes and throws Saddam Hussein there, Saddam Hussein was not secular. I don't believe he was secular, but I do not believe he was a good guy. But then he brings the people from Iran that have been in the schools in Iran, educated in Iran, funded by Iran to govern in Iraq. And let them do whatever they want, and the result is the Daesh. So it is where we think the international community should come up to come on a stand. Standing against any form of use of political Islam in the region. When the Baloch people have been made poor, they cannot say that there is no school near there. For many centuries, the Islamic school have been the only school that people have gone for educating themselves. There is no other school, there is no education system from the Pakistani government or Iranian government. Then they go to those schools that Pakistan provide. So it is where we think that's the reason we think Baluchistan being a part of Pakistan in this way, or Iran in this way that it is today, it is going to backfire for the Baloch people, for the region, and for the international community. And we are seeing that both Iran and Pakistan creating circumstances for a new kind of Islamic state in Baluchistan. And this is why we think the international community should come out and support and make sure that this kind of support for Islamic, using Islam as a political tool, be it by Baloch, be it by Pakistan or Iran or in the region, should be countered to many extent. And I thank you very much. And I think it was, at least I accept, I think 90% of the critic, particularly Baloch struggle, should rethink itself. There is no doubt about that one.
Yeah, thank you everybody for.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sheikh Kumar.
Have a nice day.